So this week's lesson is on the First World War. As it was called, a war to end all wars by many of the policymakers involved in this conflict, particularly Woodrow Wilson. Woodrow Wilson had really sought to keep the United States out of World War One, and indeed, the United States doesn't get involved in the First World War until April of 1917, at least as an official combatant and as a country that had declared war on Germany, on the Central Powers. When the United States got involved in the First World War, it went to great lengths to promote the war. The war was not a tremendously popular conflict for the United States to get involved in. Many Americans saw it as a war, a European war on the other side of the Atlantic that the United States should not have anything to do with. Some critics claimed it was a war that was, being fought largely because armament manufacturers wanted to profit from the war industries. And so there was a lot of controversy surrounding the First World War when the United States ultimately entered into this conflict. The Wilson administration promoted the conflict with a robust propaganda campaign run by particularly George Creel, the Creel Committee, that produced propaganda flyers like this one you're looking at here that depicts the Germans as the evil, brutish, barbaric German Hun. Because of a series of events, increasing amounts of people began to see Germany negatively, and the United States government very much promoted that. That the Germans had encouraged Austria to go to war with Serbia after the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, that the Germans had been sinking ships with submarines. They had invaded through neutral Belgium, killing civilians. They were the first to use gas, and so there was a lot of anti-German sentiment in the United States. And in the United States, the United States actually had several thousand non-citizen German nationals put into what we might refer to as like internment camps. They weren't citizens; they were German nationals that were living in the United States when war broke out, and there were several thousand that were put into internment camps as a result of this. There was an intense and robust anti-German propaganda selling. For example, sauerkraut in the cities of the United States was renamed Victory Cabbage. Once the war began, I also should note too, the war led to the return to the use of what's called the Sedition and Espionage Acts, which were first used by the John Adams administration amid tremendous controversy. And the Wilson administration pursued jail sentences for individuals that made free speech violations, which could involve speaking out against the United States' war policy. Socialist and union leader Eugene V. Debs was the most remembered of those sentenced to prison for free speech violations because of his speech in Canton, Ohio, after the United States entered the war against Germany. Woodrow Wilson, though, hoped to use the end game of the First World War as a way to create a lasting peace in the world, to create an international order that could prevent the occurrence of another conflict of this nature. And unfortunately, Woodrow Wilson fell short on a lot of these lofty goals. He fell short in the United States because of political disputes with individuals like Henry Cabot Lodge, the Republican, and he fell short in Versailles, the conference ending World War One, largely because he had underestimated the initiative of the imperialist powers and their resistance to his rhetoric, which was very anti-imperialist. Okay, so World War One. When we look at causes of the conflict, the causes of the conflict are there's quite a few. In one respect, you have old disputes between France and Germany over areas like Alsace and Lorraine, which are on the border areas with Germany and France. Those have been disputed for hundreds of years. and most specifically, they had been fought over during the founding of the German nation in the 19th century. There was also an arms race between the British and the Germans. It was particularly a naval arms race. And that naval arms race had created increasing imperial tensions between the British and the Germans. There was also, and this is probably the biggest factor, at least when it comes to the beginning of the war, was nationalism, particularly nationalism within the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire, and I'll show you a map in a moment, but the Austro-Hungarian Empire was made up of many different ethnicities and groups. There was something like a dozen significant different cultural groups within Austria-Hungary. In fact, the reason that Austria-Hungary was called Austria-Hungary, it used to be the Austrian Empire, and in the 19th century, the name was changed effectively to by the Austrians and the Hungarians to placate Hungarian nationalists who were threatening to secede from the Austro-Hungarian Empire if they didn't receive greater representation. And of course, the most notable of these nationalist movements when it comes to the beginning of World War I is Serbian nationalism, or more generally Slavic nationalism, which was in the heart of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. There's also treaties, and there's a lot of old animosities. The French have animosities to the Germans have animosities to the French. The Russians have animosities towards the Germans and vice versa. So there were a lot of old animosities. And these factors combined to create a collection of secret alliance treaties. Germany had become aligned specifically with Austria-Hungary. France and Russia were aligned, and that was largely because if the Russians were at war with Germany, the Russians wanted to feel like they had an ally on the other side of Germany. And similarly to France, that if the Germans attacked France, which was a great fear of France, that they would have the Russians fighting on the Eastern Front. And then probably the most significant for the spark is the Russian alliance with Slavic and Serbian nationalists in the Balkans area, the area that makes up today where countries like Serbia, Bosnia, Croatia, and so forth are located, the former Yugoslavia. So you can see here, and the arrows in the Austro-Hungarian Empire point to all the different ethnicities that all the different ethnicities and cultural groups, nationalist groups, that were part of, that were under control by the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you had these nationalist movements that were really kind of threatening to fracture the empire. Of course, the catalyst for war, and this is a result, of course, of the tensions within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, was the assassination of the Archduke, to the heir to the crown in Austria-Hungary, Franz Ferdinand, in Sarajevo. He's shot by a Slavic or a Serbian nationalist. And this results in basically the beginning of the war, the so-called the Guns of August of 1914. Russia, what happens is this: Austria-Hungary basically placed demands on Serbia that the Austro-Hungarian military and military police should be able to go in Austria-Hungary, effectively impart martial law and control the area directly until they found the culprit. This was unacceptable to the Serbians, and so as a result of this, Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. After Austria-Hungary declares war, Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary because they have an alliance with the Serbians that says if Austria-Hungary declares war on Serbia, Russia will come to their aid. Germany has an alliance with Austria-Hungary that says if Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary, that Germany will come to the aid of Austria. France has an alliance with Russia that says if Russia is attacked or at war with Germany, they'll come to the aid of Russia. And so Russia declares war on Austria-Hungary.
Germany declares war on Russia. France declares war on Germany. Germany then will invade France through neutral countries, and Britain will declare war. So that's how the kind of chips fall. That's how the dominoes fall over.
And here you see a map that depicts the belligerent powers, with in brown the Central Powers, and in the green the Triple Entente of Britain, France, Russia, and of course later the United States. And the Central Powers were made up primarily of Germany, Austria-Hungary, and the Ottoman Empire. At the outset of the war, and this is not just Germany, but this is of course other countries as well, there was a sort of euphoria about the war. You see depicted here in the top, you see German students leaving to enlist in the army. To the left, you see the reading of the Kaiser's declaration of war in Berlin on August 1st, 1914, thus beginning the so-called Guns of August. But there was a sort of euphoria about this, that people were going to the front to become to become heroes, to become men, to do what strong people do and fight for the German nation. The conflict was very much romanticized, and very, very few individuals gave much consideration to just how devastating this new industrial war could be. Another picture depicting the romanticized view of war that prevailed in the beginning periods of the war. Here we see German reservists departing as heroes, and you see here with a wife or a girlfriend who's going with her man to not to battle, but to service into the armed forces, and she's very much parading him off in a way of demonstrating that her man was courageous, that he was manly, that he was a masculine person who was going to do the right thing and was going to become a hero. This was a romanticized understanding of war, and one that the German nation, as well as the French and the British and the Russians and so forth, will soon learn is very much a myth. The First World War became a horrid meat grinder, in which there was really a meat grinder of industrial war of attrition, in which there was no room or ability, for the most part, for an individual to be some romantic hero. Instead, it was an industrialized, brutal war in which no one individual could have really much of anything to say about whether or not the offensive succeeded and so forth. And it was an industrial stalemate, and millions of people died, and most of the fighting on the Western Front was static. They launched massive, huge offensives that got you 100 yards, maybe a half mile, or 1 or 2 miles if you're lucky. And so, at the outset of the war, very few people thought that the war could be or would be this industrial meat grinder, ultimate nightmare of death. And it was romanticized in a similar way that, if you know anything about the United States' history, a similar manner in which the American Civil War was romanticized at its outset.
Now, Germany felt that it had to attack France, and it had to attack France first, and the best way to attack France was through neutral countries, because they would catch the French by surprise, and it might allow them to win a quick victory. Germany feels they have to do this because they're facing a war between France and Russia. So you have two fighting forces on both fronts, and it was believed by German military strategists that Germany could not survive fighting a two-front war, that they had to be able to focus on one front or the other. And so the Schlieffen Plan was designed to alleviate this threat. And so the Schlieffen Plan occurred in which the Germans invaded France through the neutral countries, Belgium and the Netherlands. And the idea was they would catch the French by surprise and win an important victory. It took France only 6 weeks to mobilize their military, and by contrast, it actually took the Russians 12 weeks. So this is why they chose to go to France first. It's a smaller country, be easier to take it, and they're going to mobilize faster anyway. Of course, that fails. The war stabilizes and becomes a stalemate right around the Marne River. If you look on this map, you see the Marne River. Loosely speaking, the Western Front stabilizes right there, and it becomes a stalemate. But the reason that this is important, aside from it becoming a stalemate, is that the German action of trying to attack France through the neutral countries was the first of two major actions that really vilified Germany and made them it ultimately led to them be labeled the culprit of World War I, which was unjust. That wasn't fair. It really was not a just treaty, but it was the action of going through the neutral countries first. That was the first thing that led to Germany being forced to sign what's called the War Guilt Clause.
The Schlieffen Plan broke down near the Marne River, where really the German plan had fallen short, largely because, one, Germany had underestimated the strength of the resistance of groups like the Belgians and the British, of course, and the French. And, of course, also at the same time, the Russians get involved in Prussia earlier than planned as well. The Germans also, there was a problem with communication. They were not moving nearly as fast as they thought they would move. And the Germans make their turn, the turn in the Schlieffen Plan that would have been to envelop Paris too early. And they're stopped at the Marne River, where the Allies, the French, and the British Expeditionary Force counterattack at the Battle of the Marne. And this becomes known for the Allies as the Miracle of the Marne, in which the Allies turn the Germans back. And the Germans begin what at this time is referred to sometimes as the Great Retreat, as they retreated back some 15 kilometers. Following the Great Retreat, there's a series of battles. And ultimately, the series of battles culminates in what's referred to as the Race to the Sea. And the Race to the Sea was in which the Germans, trying to respond to the failure of the Schlieffen Plan, to try to respond to that, and the Allies trying to also take advantage of the German retreat. The two sides were both moving north towards the Belgian border with the North Sea to try to flank the other. And they're fighting up and racing towards the sea to try to take advantage of that northern flank, to try to outflank the other and get behind them and thereby win a decisive victory. Of course, as I'm sure some of you guys probably understand from World War I, both sides fail. Neither side is able to gain a decisive victory. Neither side is able to successfully outflank the other. And the Race to the Sea basically establishes the basic line wherein the trenches that the Western Front becomes so infamous for are ultimately established. Of course, another factor for the Germans, and it really came to personify the ultimate fear of Otto von Bismarck and of Schlieffen and of other German military thinkers, the two-front threat in which they faced a war from Russia and France simultaneously. The Schlieffen Plan had been designed to take the French out quickly and allow the Russians, the Germans, to turn and face the Russians before the Russians had a chance to mobilize fully. But the Russians, reacting in support of their alliance with France to enact the two-front war, engaged Eastern Prussia early in August of 1914, within the first month of the war. And here you see Russian troops moving into East Prussia. The Russian invasion and mobilization into Prussia really began the two-front war for Germany. It also demonstrated some of Russia's weaknesses. Russia was certainly behind on industrialization, and they faced issues, material issues and leadership issues. The Battle of Tannenberg, only a month into the war, proved to be Germany's probably greatest victory of the war, and it really established a trend for the Eastern Front. The Eastern Front was a more fluid front. It was a much larger front too, that stretched from Eastern Europe down into the Balkans, and it was a much longer front, and it was a more fluid front. It was not embodied by the almost static lines of the Western Front. Russia, of course, Germany will really be able to control the Russian front, and Russia is never going to overrun Germany, as you will ultimately see in World War II. And by 1918, with the rise of Vladimir Lenin and the Bolsheviks in Russia, Russia will be taken out of the war in 1918 with the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. Tannenberg was the greatest German victory. They completely annihilated the Second Russian Army, and the result was to really set the tone, as I mentioned in the last slide, for the war in the East. And it also moved Field Marshal Hindenburg and Ludendorff into a status of almost mythic proportions, and the two ultimately, between 1916 and 1918, become effectively de facto military dictators in Germany as the country becomes absolutely consumed by the war.
Of course, the war, World War One was a war of attrition, and what a war of attrition, what that means, a war of attrition is a war in which the victor is the group that is able to sacrifice the most, to commit the most into a conflict. The ones who have the most resources, the most people, and the most supplies, the one that can outlast the other side. That's what it means to win a war of attrition. To attrit an enemy means to basically slowly wear them down with overwhelming force. So wars of attrition tend to be long. They tend to be stalemated. They tend to result in great hardships for home fronts because wars of attrition involve blockades. You're trying to withhold things from the other side, and so usually you have hunger on the home front, economic depression on the home front, and you often in stalemates have in stalemated wars of attrition you have incredibly devastating human loss of life. The American Civil War, by the way, is also a characteristic, ultimately becomes a characteristic war of attrition. So World War I it's an industrial war. It's a war in which, on the Western Front at least, the Eastern Front was a little bit more fluctuating, but on the Western Front, in France and Belgium, the fighting were fought in trenches, in stalemates, in mud and hardened lines that were very, very difficult to break. And this stalemate, is really the inability of huge numbers of troops to overcome the stalemate is really exemplified in battles like Verdun and at the Battle of the Somme. So World War I, and I'll show you some pictures here, it's an industrial war, so you have like machine guns, you have heavy artillery, but the actual use of troops, infantry tactics, has not really changed. And so you have this incredibly destructive power in the form of, machine guns, particularly gas, these types of things, heavy artillery. But the infantry tactics are still that when you want to break through the enemy's lines, you get your guys out of your trenches and you run in kind of like a flat line against the line. And so because of that, troops suffered horrible losses. The Battle of the Somme, the British suffered something like 60,000 casualties in one day in 1916 at the Battle of the Somme. And that remains the most deadly single day in the war for the British, in the history of any war for the British, the most deadly day for the British military. So grand strategy in the war was to basically, ultimately, to starve the other out. The both sides would try to adapt new technologies like gas and machine guns and artillery and tanks. They tried to adapt these technologies to break the enemy's lines, but they're never able to break their lines. They're never able to use things like tanks, for example, in the way that they were used in World War II, which were used to break through an enemy's lines. Instead, they were used for infantry support. And so all of the technologies that are developed during World War I are really unable to break the stalemate. And so it becomes a war that's fought by and large on the goal of starving the other out. The British do this by blockading Germany. And you see here the British Navy in the North Sea. They blockade Germany, and Germany's only response is their own blockade. But Germany doesn't have a large above-water navy, and as the map below, as you see with the map below, Britain pretty much could easily, with their navy, cover the German coast. So there's really no way, Britain's an island, there was really no way that the Germans could effectively blockade Great Britain in the way that Britain can blockade them. And so Germany was being starved out, and the only real answer for the Germans were to respond with their own kind of naval war, and this was unrestricted submarine warfare. And this meant that the Germans would use their U-boats, and I'll show you a picture in just a minute. They'll use their U-boats to sink any vessel that they deem to be collaborating in supporting the war effort of the Allies. And of course that leads, as you see here with the Lusitania Notice flyer from 1915, this leads to the May 1915 sinking of the Lusitania off of the southern coast of Ireland. The Lusitania, however, was carrying ammunitions, and the German U-boat commanders knew this. And that's why the Lusitania sunk so fast. It sunk in a matter of minutes. It went right down, and there were reciprocal explosions. But it didn't get remembered in Great Britain or in the United States in that respect. Instead, no one was told that the ship had munitions on it. It was a passenger liner, and something like 1,500 people died in this sinking. And the way it was presented was that in the United States and in Great Britain was that the Germans had basically targeted a passenger liner, not a military target. And it also, this was step two, the unrestricted submarine warfare, the sinking of things like the Lusitania, were huge factors in why at the end of the war Germany is labeled as the culprit of the war. In the United States, Wilson responded, despite knowing that that ship had munitions, Wilson responded by basically threatening to cut diplomatic relations with Germany. And Germany stops for a period of about a year and a half. Germany stopped unrestricted submarine warfare, and they started using a kind of restricted submarine warfare in which they would surface and announce to the ship that they're going to sink them, and it was not as effective, obviously. Wilson's neutrality was that the United States should be able to trade with anybody, Germany or Britain, but the problem is that the trade was inevitably going to fall into the hands of the British, not the Germans. And the policy of neutrality by Wilson has really been criticized for inevitably drawing the United States into the war by making the United States an ineffective ally of the British against Germany and making them a target of German submarines.
The weapons that really made for the stalemate that becomes trench warfare on the Western Front, two of the most significant were the usage of barbed wire and, of course, also the machine gun. And below you see an example of a German Maxim gun, and this picture is one of the many machine guns that would have lined the trenches. And of course above you see an example of the effectiveness of barbed wire, and you see of course this depicted in this British Army song from World War I. If you want the old battalion, I know where they are, hanging on the old barbed wire. I've seen them hanging on the old barbed wire. I've seen them hanging on the old barbed wire. This is a British Army song from World War I, and it conveys the reality that barbed wire was an incredibly important defensive development that made these infantry charges that rammed up against the trenches of the other side. It made these infantry charges very difficult. And together, these two technologies, these new technologies that are a product of the Industrial Revolution, the machine gun and barbed wire, together these technologies really serve to make the trenches very effective defensive networks that were incredibly devastating to infantry assaults. This is a general look at the trench systems and what the trench systems looked like from a defensive standpoint. Trench systems had dugouts where people could go as far as 15 meters below ground, and people could sleep down there and could generally be safe from shell fire in dugouts. And so you can get an idea here as you can see the troops moving through what would be called no man's land towards the trenches. You can get an idea of just how elaborate some of these trench complexes were. The potential of modern military technology was devastating, and images like this, the rubble, conveys just how devastating new military technology was. And of course, the causes of this particularly were in advanced developments of long-ranged heavy artillery and explosive shells. Trenches were or become a way of life for soldiers. On the right, you see British soldiers dug into the trenches in the Somme campaign of 1916, and the Somme becomes notoriously deadly for the British armed forces, for the British military. Still today, the first battle of the Somme is the most deadly day of the British military. Also, mud and water in the trenches, as depicted in the picture below to the left, was also a huge problem for many soldiers fighting in the trenches. These types of conditions gave rise to a malady called trench foot, which many soldiers would suffer as they would get this sort of skin rot on their foot that was caused by the foot being wet and submerged for long periods of time. So a very, very difficult and uncomfortable environment, but a product of a new industrial war of attrition. The Germans were masters of trench construction, and they adopt a highly developed defensive posture in which you had very, very well developed dugouts. You see the sandbags in this picture in a German dugout area. Of course, the British also used dugouts. Dugouts were, again, as deep as 15 meters under the ground, and these could withstand shell hits from above. And soldiers were often crammed in these areas. They would sleep in these areas, as depicted in this image of British soldiers in a dugout on the Western Front.
So I want to show you guys a few images of the technologies of World War One. This, of course, here you're looking at gas, chemical gas like chlorine gas, mustard gas, were innovated on the battlefield during World War One. They're horrifying weapons, and it has since led to their outlaw in international law. These gases oftentimes cause severe hemorrhaging of the lungs and the skin, and very bloody and awful deaths. But it was unable to break the enemy's lines. It's because you can't control the direction the wind is going. This was first used by the Germans, but the Allies used this as well. Tanks. You're looking here at a British tank, tanks were used only as infantry support, and you can kind of get a feel for this as you see the troops are marching here out in the no man's land, if you will, and there's the tank right there. The way tanks would be used in World War II would be as spearheads for lightning fast offensive operations, offensive movements. But in World War One, the tank was only used really for infantry support, and that made its effectiveness, it made it much less effective. They were slow in a very rudimentary machine. They used to fill up with carbon monoxide inside of them, and it was very uncomfortable. But there were early technologies there. The machine gun was a very, very effective technology during this war, and probably the biggest reason why you had the stalemate was because of the machine gun. It gave you the ability that if you have an infantry charge, the machine gun gave you the ability to exact devastating casualties on the enemy very quickly. Of course, the U-boat that I just mentioned, the underseat boat, very, very critical component of the war. Of course, there were submarines used to greatly inconsequentially, but they were used in the Civil Wars too, particularly the CSS Hunley. But of course, the U-boat developed by the Germans and used in World War I here was very significant in the war. Equally as significant, heavy artillery. This is one of the big railway guns that they used to have, and these could lob explosive shells huge distances. And World War I became really associated with massive aerial bombardment from heavy artillery. And it led to the terminology of something called shell shock, which was basically an early way of them trying to describe extreme post-traumatic stress disorder, which they did not understand at the time. But heavy artillery had a devastating impact on troops and on the psychology of troops, the mindset of troops. Very, very significant part of the war. The Battle of Verdun is one of the most notoriously remembered for the incessant artillery bombardment. Of course, other things, airplanes, the Zeppelin. It is first during World War I that you see the threat of bombing of civilian targets to become a reality. But again, this is a very rudimentary, basic, and inconsequential technology. The biggest contribution of air technology during World War I was particularly related to reconnaissance. But of course, the fighter planes, Baron von Richtenhofen, Eddie Rickenbacker, people like this, of course, did become very almost like legendary figures for the early era of dogfighting. I suppose from a pilot's perspective, maybe it was the ultimate moment, but in terms of the war, relatively inconsequential, but a new and very important technology for the future, of course. Now, 1917 becomes a really significant year in the conflict, and I'll try to finish this up pretty quick. But in 1917, the United States enters the war, and the reason we entered the war was in part because Germany resumed unrestricted submarine warfare, and was warfare, and was sinking American vessels and Allied vessels that were merchant marine and so on and so forth. And the other reason was because there was also we intercepted something called the Zimmermann Note, or the Zimmermann Telegram. It was sent from the German Foreign Secretary to try to encourage Mexico to attack the United States in the West, and thereby, of course, keep the United States out of the war. And this led to a U.S. war declaration in April of 1917. Similarly, at the same time, the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in Russia, was beginning in Russia at least. And this ultimately led to the Russians being taken out of the war. V.I. Lenin, Vladimir Ilyanov Lenin, led a movement to take Russia out of the war. And this happened in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, and Russia was taken out of the war. And Germany, for a moment, was able to turn and focus attention on the Western Front, albeit they were still unable to win the war in that period. But the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was highly significant, obviously, for establishing the roots of what becomes known as Leninism, the roots of the modern world communist movement that obviously embodied concern for the United States during the Cold War. And it was very significant. Lenin's message to the colonized people of the world was that communism was the solution, that communism was the thing that would undermine the capitalists who imperialized small developing world countries. And so, Leninism at this time became significant, very significant for revolutionary figures of the future, like Ho Chi Minh, who actually read the works of Lenin at this time. And so very significant development for the future. Now, when the war ends, the United States, of course, gets involved in the war in 1917. It took us quite a while to become mobilized, actually. We weren't actually fighting in World War I until 1918, the beginning of 1918. And we contributed on the battlefield, but the biggest contribution was psychological, like the idea of new troops, fresh supplies. And Germany was being starved out, and actually the surrender came generally because the German people and the economy could no longer stand under the embargo. And so a peace was signed, and the German people largely hoped, the German leadership largely hoped that as the war ended, as the ceasefire was signed, that President Woodrow Wilson in the United States could be the one that would assure a just peace for them. And actually the German leadership, after Kaiser Wilhelm II fled, very much invested itself in the promise of Wilson, because Wilson promoted a different kind of peace. Wilson promoted an ideal of peace without victory, which meant a peace in which the victors would not punish the defeated to such a degree that would lead to future conflicts. Wilson envisions a new apparatus for world peace. He believed that World War I could be a war to end all wars, and he issues this. This is the essence of his 14 points, which is his kind of idealistic vision for peace in the world. And below are the key components to it: the League of Nations, a body of collective security, kind of like the UN, that would oversee peace in the world. Free trade, League of Nations would oversee these things. Self-determination, meaning that people should be able to democratically choose their leaderships. Freedom of the seas, free trade, freedom of the seas, abolishing secret treaties, armament reductions, and these types of things. And what would make it all happen? Wilson believed in a democratization of the world, and particularly in Europe. He was particularly interested in Europe, not as much the developing world. But Wilson believed in peace through democracy and free trade, like American democracy. And the League of Nations would be the thing that would carry this vision through. And he fundamentally believed in not promoting a victor goes the spoils policy. He didn't want to promote a peace treaty, which is at Versailles, the Versailles Peace Treaty. He didn't want to support a peace treaty that was going to place a significant amount of blame or guilt on the defeated party. And so after Germany surrendered, they really put their hope behind Wilson, that Wilson would be the one that would prevent the old imperialists of Britain and France from punishing Germany too excessively and potentially creating an apparatus that would lead to long-term peace in the world. Of course, there is no peace without victory. Wilson was in a rock between a hard place, because Wilson was the only person at the Versailles Peace Conference that you could say was an anti-imperialist. All the other people at the at the conference, Lloyd George, for example, Clemenceau from France, Vittoro Orlando from Italy, all of these individuals were imperialists, and they believed in using the peace treaty to benefit their nation, to rebuild their nation, to pay off the debt for the war. And they were not going to go along with Wilson's endeavor to end empires. Now, granted, Germany was an empire too, and they didn't really want to. I'm sure that if they had been in a different situation, they wouldn't have wanted to end an empire either, but they were defeated, and their empires were going to be stripped from them. So Wilson was unable, amid that, to get really much of his goals accomplished. Really, the only thing that gets accomplished in that respect was acceptance of the League of Nations, which ultimately is replaced by the UN. But the League of Nations was really a bit of a failure because the League of Nations, the United States actually never joins the League of Nations. When the treaties brought back to the United States, there was controversy in the United States and disputes over the rhetoric of anti-imperialism and its threat to the Monroe Doctrine, issues with treaties that could draw the United States into a future war in Europe. And so the United States never signs, and it never passes. And so Wilson, in a lot of respects, given the amount that people hoped from Wilson, you'd have to say that Versailles was a failure. There is no peace without victory. Germany was forced to sign the war guilt clause. They were labeled a culprit of the war, primarily for the invasion through the neutral countries and for the use of unrestricted submarine warfare. Their military was reduced to 100,000 only. There was no heavy artillery or air force allowed, which led them, by the way, to develop missile technology, which is one of the reasons why the V-2 rocket was developed by the time of World War II. The Rhineland, which borders France, was made a demilitarized zone because the French were concerned of them using it as a staging ground for a future invasion. And they were given huge reparation payments to pay for the Allies' debt from the war. They also had their colonies stripped from them. This situation leaves Germany a very defeated place. And the economy, as the economy in the 1920s for Germany begins to deteriorate more and more and more, the Versailles Treaty played a role in allowing for the rise of the Nazis, rise of fascists in Germany, who were, many of them, World War I veterans, including Hitler, and they used what they called the crime of Versailles. They used this incredibly harsh treaty as fodder to build support. In addition to that, of course, they used anti-Semitism as well, and extreme nationalism. Fascism refers to an extreme nationalism that usually puts its strength behind a singular leader, a military leader, who uses military force to effectively expand and create a purified domain for a group of people that the fascist movement considers to be superior. Fascism is fundamentally racism. It's fundamentally based on racism, in the sense that fascism creates a nation, a staunchly nationalistic nation. It creates that around pitting an animosity against a racial other. In Germany, it was Jewish people and also Slavic people. And so fascism is fundamentally racism. It's a militaristic, nationalistic campaign to purify a particular area for a particular culture and race of people, if that makes sense. And it was, certainly Versailles was at least in part responsible for establishing the ingredients that made it possible for the fascists to rise in the manner that they did in Germany, the Nazis.
World War I was the most deadly war that humanity had ever seen. And the devastation, gets even worse in some respects during World War II. But the casualties of World War I are almost incomprehensible. Around about 9 million killed, almost 7 million civilians dead. Air raids, the principle of targeting civilian populaces through blockades or through rudimentary air raids became a new tactic as both the British and the Germans sought to undermine the morale of the home front. There was a loss of some 60% of the forces that were mobilized in the war. There were genocides, most notably the Armenian genocide in Turkey. There were huge devastation of cities, huge devastation of the land, and tremendous cost as really the Western European nations really lose a generation. And this deeply affected how the victors and the losers looked at the history of the war as you move past the war and you move towards the Second World War. As many in Germany sought to avenge the crime of Versailles, and others on the side, like the French side, for example, built the Maginot Line and sought to do anything to prevent another war of this kind.